There is a particular kind of American filmmaker who doesn't arrive through film school, manifestos, or cinephile pilgrimages. He arrives sideways by accident, via shipyards, taxi meters, peep shows, and police raids, and the slow realization that whatever the law says today will be rewritten tomorrow. Kirdy Stevens belongs squarely in that lineage. Not a provocateur by temperament, not a hustler by myth, but a pragmatist whose work ended up reshaping the nature of industry feature films. Stevens's name is now inseparable from the early Taboo series, titles that became shorthand for a whole subsection of VHS-era sensibility. But the road there was long, winding, and fascinating. Born in San Francisco in 1920, Stevens spent his childhood in an orphanage. He left as a teenager and drifted across the country, riding freight trains and living an itinerant life. Such origins quietly rewire one's thinking about risk, authority, and survival. By the time World War II arrived, Stevens was back in San Francisco working in shipyards. After the war, he drove taxis and trucks, none of which sounds like a prelude to cinema, but it matters. Stevens's films would later feel grounded, domestic, almost stubbornly workaday in their emotional logic. The action happened in kitchens, bedrooms, and living rooms, not in abstract fantasy spaces. Desire arrived through routine, boredom, and proximity. He married Helene Terry in the early 1950s, and that partnership became the quiet engine of his filmmaking career. Terry would go on to write nearly all of his scripts, shaping tone, structure, and character, while Stevens handled direction, crew, and getting the best out of his cast. However, Stevens didn't enter mature cinema as an artist, he entered it as a technician. In 1957, he and two partners built a black and white film lab to process adult material, much of it illegally imported from Europe. When supply proved unreliable, they started shooting their own and opened a venue showing short loops, often on panorama-style machines. As things progressed, his competitive edge was color. While others projected grainy, monochrome nudity, Stevens's films popped with saturation and polish. It was less an aesthetic choice than a market correction. Then came the raids. Stevens beat some charges, lost others, and pivoted again. He sold undeveloped rolls of nude photographs taken from shoots, with distribution via photography magazines, inviting buyers to develop the pictures themselves. When the 1969 Supreme Court decision, Stanley v. Georgia, affirmed private possession of obscene material, Stevens moved into mail-order films, complete with legal advice and age verification. That window closed too, ending with a plea deal that effectively pushed him out of mail-order distribution. What emerges here is not rebellion, but adaptability. Stevens treated censorship like weather. You didn't argue with it, you dressed for it and waited for it to change. In the early 1970s, Stevens attempted to go legit, or at least adjacent. He produced R-rated exploitation features such as 6 Women in '71 and Inside Amy in '74. These were titles that flirted with eroticism without crossing the legal line. It didn't work. Drive-ins were closing, police attention was relentless, and the financing collapsed. After this, Stevens returned to X-rated filmmaking, this time committing fully to feature-length films shot on 35mm. Sophomore attempts, such as Little Me and Marla Strangelove and A Taste of Sugar, both released in 1978, were transitional works, narrative-first, modestly scaled, and clearly feeling their way towards something more ambitious. They didn't explode commercially, but they taught Stevens how to pace a story, how to let character carry momentum toward the genre content, and how to treat mature filmmaking as feature cinema rather than extended loops. Then came Taboo in 1980, Starring Kay Parker, the film wrapped genre content in a melodramatic domestic framework of confession, repression, and transgression. It wasn't subtle, it didn't need to be, but it was perfect for the VHS era and for those wanting to watch something risque at home. The success was explosive, but unevenly rewarding. Stevens and Terry sold the film to distributor Norman Arno at VCX for what would later look like a fraction of its true value. Arno reportedly boasted about how many video cassettes he was moving. That bragging sparked a realization: Taboo wasn't a fluke, it was a format. Stevens went on to direct Taboo 2, 3, 4, the younger generation, 5 and 7, effectively inventing one of adult cinema's first true franchises. The sequels leaned even harder into soap operatic continuity. Characters returned, family dynamics evolved, desire metastasized across generations. The popularity of these films saw Stevens at the height of his industry success throughout a large part of the 1980s. However, while his other directorial efforts, such as Playing with Fire in 1983 and Empire of the Sins in '88, were well received, they were commercially far less successful than anything released within the Taboo franchise. What is worth noting, however, is that despite the subject matter, a Kirdy Stevens film never felt overly transgressive in the modern sense. There's no shock for shock's sake, no nihilistic edge. Instead, there's a strange gentleness to the staging, a sense that the director is more interested in emotional escalation than visual extremity. This likely owes much to Terry's scripts, which often play like daytime melodrama stripped of euphemism. It also reflects Stevens' on-set reputation. Accounts consistently describe him as respectful, calm, and attentive to performers' comfort, with Terry frequently present during shoots. Technically, Stevens favored clarity over flash, clean compositions, steady pacing, and an emphasis on legibility. These were films designed to survive repeat viewings on home video, and it is a large factor of why they are still so enjoyable today. While Taboo dominates his legacy, Stevens directed roughly 14 features across his career. Films like Lollipop Palace, set in 1930s San Francisco, suggest a filmmaker interested in genre play and period texture even within adult constraints. By the late 1980s, Stevens, now in his late 60s, slowed with his output. He retired after filming Taboo 7 in 1989, stepping away from an industry he had helped structurally reshape. He lived quietly afterward, passing away in 2012 at the age of 92. He was later inducted into the AVN and XRCO Halls of Fame, honors that feel almost beside the point. Kirdy Stevens didn't set out to redefine adult cinema. He didn't mythologize it. He responded to pressure, adapted to technology, trusted narrative, and treated the work seriously enough that audiences followed. His legacy isn't just Taboo, it's the idea that mature film could function like a television serial, that character continuity mattered. He helped quietly teach an entire industry how to think in chapters, arcs, and consequences, leaving behind a body of work that still resonates 40 years later.